Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz drummer, pianist, vibraphonist, and composer, the legendary Joe Chambers. He was born and bred in Philadelphia, and he talked at length about a great many things with Neon Jazz. He talked about his newest album, full of sound and beautiful vibes, and it is called Landscapes. And prior to that, he released Moving Pictures Orchestra live at Dizzy's Coca-Cola in NYC. He spent a year at the Philadelphia Conservatory and would go on to captivate the world after moving to New York in 1963. He would play on Freddie Hubbard's LP Breaking Point, and he would go on to play with the best in the avant-garde jazz realm, with cats like Eric Dolphy. Then he would gig with the likes of Charles Mingus, Wayne Shorter, Bobby Hutcherson, McCoy, Tyner, Chick Corea, and so many more over his career. His mentor is Max Roach, and he has been a part of that outfit known as Boom, a percussion ensemble. He is full of great stories, wisdom, and cool, so dig Joe and this interview, my friends.
Hey, thanks for taking a little time out for me today.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in here. Just kind of give me a brief overview of what's been going on with you lately.
I moved to Wilmington, North Carolina in 2008. I had a position down here at the University of North Carolina as a so-called distinguished professor of jazz. So I've been a professor since 2008 here in the University of North Carolina. And that's why I'm currently living here. You know, teaching, involved in all the academic stuff. But I've been... I made a couple of records, as you can see. I made the Moving Pictures Orchestra record I did in 2012, and it came out in 2013, and it got a nomination. And I'm proud of that piece because it's a large orchestra, and I did the composing and arranging. It's actually... That music is from a 2004 commission from the Lincoln Center, Jazz at Lincoln Center people to do a piece in 2004. That's what that whole music, most of that music is from that. Not doing a lot of appearing, working because of the position. I did go to Europe a couple times. I did a tour in 2010 with the World Saxophone group with David Murray and Boom. That's the remnants of the percussion group that we had with Max Roach. I did that, and I made a couple trips. I did also play that music, that Moving Pictures music in Europe too in 2010. Then I, put this record out, the most recent record. That's the Landscapes. I've been doing more touring, more appearing. I just left New York. I was in New York at the end of February, and was out in California in this past winter and stuff like that. So I'm going to get out, and I'm going to be doing more playing and touring.
Right on. Well, let me talk about these two albums you sent over, the Moving Pictures Orchestra. Beautiful album, live at Dizzy's. Talk to me a little bit about capturing this in a live environment. It sounded really good. How did it feel to do that live?
The feeling was, well, first of all, I don't know if you're familiar with David Weiss.
Yes.
David Weiss is a trumpet player, and he was the one who assembled those players. When you're in New York, New York, let's face it, the places for the arts in this country is New York and L.A., with, a few other places, even Kansas City included. But that current crop of those people on that CD, they're the younger breed of cosmopolitan musicians. There's several generations. I've seen several generations of myself of what I call a cosmopolitan, but the cosmopolitan musicians are the people that are not only jazz players, but it's just like most jazz players, you got to do a lot of stuff. They maybe work in their shows, theater, they record, they do the TV and stuff like that. And when I got to New York in the early 60s, the people that were what you consider cosmopolitan were people like Thad Jones, Snooky Young. I don't know if these names mean anything to you. Jerome Richardson,
yeah,
Garnett Brown, Pepper Adams. Now that group, they're pretty much gone. A lot of those people are gone. And then you have another set that came in, and those were the people like, I was a part of that myself. And but these are the young players. If you look on that CD in the list, you might not even know some of those people.
Yeah.
Craig Handy, he's been around for a while, but they were young, and I specifically told him to get that group, to pick from that group. These are people who just got out of music school, got out of the schools in New York, or New School, or New York University, or anywhere. Those are what that represents, and they are all good, what I call cosmopolitan players. A cosmopolitan player is a player who could play anything, could read anything. They could read any music. They could play jazz. They could play classical music, anything like that. And so that's who that group is. That's what they represent. Except for myself, maybe Steve Barrios. Steve Barrios is a long time. He passed in 2013, but he was a Hispanic. He's a percussionist and who plays, and it's a rare situation, someone who can play, who's versed in the Afro-Cuban music and also plays jazz drums. That's a very rare situation. And another one that could fit that bill would be Bobby Sanabria. That's who those players are that you see.
Right on. The movements that go through this album are wonderful. But I really like the way M Squad comes together. It just sounded like you guys were having a lot of fun with that tune.
Oh, absolutely. Well, there were 4 movements to the actual Moving Pictures suite, which was the prelude, really, Irina, and then there's a ballad, Ruth, and then there is the Bembe section, which is Bembe, I think it's 2 versions, 9 and 2. And Caravanserai. Those are the actual movements. The other arrangements were arrangements that I had written and that I had to fill out the CD. So M Squad was a piece. I don't know if you're old enough to remember the old it was a detective series called the M Squad with Lee Marvin. It was the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
And that was the theme. I heard that theme way back when I was in high school, and I always wanted to do it. It's a typical bassy type arrangement, and when I showed it to the players, I remember I showed it to them the first night of the engagement at Dizzy's. And in the manner in which, when I say the bassy from the 20s and 30s, Kansas City, where you live, right? You should know about Kansas City.
Oh yeah,
you should know. And the point of fact is that, not only was that an era, that you can spend. Matter of fact, when I teach jazz history, I spend a whole almost semester on Kansas City alone. Kansas City is a very particular place there. And of course, the Kansas City style was nurtured during the Tom Pendergast era. The thing about it was that they created, when I say they, I mean a lot of the big bands, Basie specifically, they created arrangements on the spot. They created instantaneous arrangements. They'd come up with a hit, with a riff, and then they worked the riff and then go in backgrounds and like that, put in the solos. That's the way they did it. Now, I mean, they all could read music. And they had written arrangements later on as they developed in, 50s and 60s. But I showed M Squad, I showed them that just that way. It's a riff right off the head. And they got it right down. They made up the backgrounds, and it's a really, I like the whole feeling of it. I really like that piece myself, the M Squad.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of a texture, the vibe that is, I love landscapes. I love the vibes in that album, and it sounds like you caught a lot of different flavors with like Havana, for instance. You really got a good feeling going on in that tone. Talk to me about this album. How did this
I'm glad you mentioned Havana, because the way I put Havana together was actually the idea I had for the album, for the CD itself. I wanted to do and which I am capable of doing. I wanted to do a me, myself, and I CD. Lay down the drum tracks, percussion tracks, keyboard tracks, and add a bass. And on Havana, that's exactly what it is. I'm playing everything. Literally. I laid down everything.
Cool.
And so that is what I wanted to do for the entire CD. Somehow, I don't know why. Well, I figured that though I would need a legitimate bass player for a lot of the music, so I just decided, well, I'll just go get a trio, a bass, drum, piano, then I'll put over the mallets, and this is what we did. But Havana is, and I like Havana too, because it captures the real Wawanko feeling, and if you know what Wawanko is, the rumba.
Yeah.
Out of Cuba, and it captures. Of course, I learned all of those claves, what they call the claves. I learned that from the people like Steve Barrios and Ray Mantilla. They showed me the real claves. So Havana is a track that I think came off pretty good.
Let me ask you this. Let me go back to the beginning of your life here. You grew up in Philly. Talk to me about how you acquired this love of not only music but jazz.
I come from a musical family. That is to say that, my parents were musicians and writers. My mother was a singer, and my father was a writer. He wanted to please. That's what he wanted to do for his career. And so I had four other siblings, 4 brothers. It was 4 of us, and 1 sister. And we all had the musical instincts, and our family made sure we had instruments. We started off very young playing. I had family band. My brother played piano. I had a brother played saxophone. My sister danced, or like that. And we, in that time, when I came up in that area, in that period, we had in what we call a rent. You could rent an instrument. You could take an instrument home and pay for it on monthly payments, weekly, whatever it was. So consequently, all of the kids, everybody picked out an instrument. Everybody I grew up in the projects. Everybody had an instrument. Of course, everybody didn't continue with it, but that's what we did. It was the nurturing of the arts at that period was very strong. We had bands. I played in the band in elementary school, and it was in preparation for playing in the band in middle school. It was all connected. And by the time I got to high school, we had the marching band, had concert orchestra band, dance band, band that played for the what they call the pep bands for the athletic events, and it was a very active environment that I grew up in, very in terms of that. And then I was an athlete too, so it was always music and athletics for me.
Was there an album specifically a jazz album growing up that you heard that blew your mind away?
Yes, it was. By the way, I have I guess I pushed this. It's not published. I got a book out about my growing up. A student in Illinois wrote a book. I've just edited it, and I'm trying to publish it. There was 2 specific albums. You see, coming up, now I'm 74, right? So when I was coming up, my mother and my parents, they made sure we heard. They brought all of the stuff home, all of the latest. I heard, my mother brought a record by Lester Young. It's called Up and Atom. I must have been 5 years old or something. I don't know if you know that cut.
Yeah.
Yeah, Up and Atom, and Buddy Richards on drums. And I remember he played a long solo, and he played this role, and I said, wow, and what is that? And she brought Lionel Hampton, And you see, we saw those people on TV. You used to see Gene Krupa and those folks on TV, you see, on TV shows. But now, it wasn't until I was 12 years old, when I was 12, I had a friend who had an older brother, and he played this Max Roach, Clifford Brown record for me. And I was like, it sounded like something from Mars, and he played Miles Davis, Blue Haze. And I remember that also sounded like something from Mars, because those people were not on TV. Yeah. Max and Miles, they weren't on TV. I discovered them later. That's my point. The point is that you cater to who you see initially. In terms of seeing and hearing, that would have been the swing era people. Well, when I heard the Max Roach and the Miles stuff, I was captured right then and there. And that was that had to be 55, something around there, 56.
So let me ask you this. You said you were into sports and music. Did you always think that you were going to get into music, or did you have other dreams?
I always knew that I was a pretty good athlete. I thought I was good, and I was pretty good. I could have gone to college. As a football player, American football. The coach was trying to, but I was also, I had been working in bands since I was 12 years old. I used to go out on weekends and play rhythm and blues and stuff like that, and make little trips. So I was making a little bit of money at that age. I knew that I wanted to find out, what that music was all about. But I also was a pretty good athlete. I played track. I ran track, played football, played basketball. And when I got to high school, I was a pretty good football player. I could have gone. The coach was trying to get me a scholarship to Virginia State. But I was, I was stuck. I was done with sports. I did it, and I wanted to find out. I remember the coach telling me, he said, "Well, look, I know you play in bands, blah blah blah, but I can get you. I know the coach down there, but such." But I didn't really want to play any more American football. I'll tell you the truth.
Yeah.
I played it, coming up in at that time, and you had these kind of rites of passage that you had to go through in the neighborhood, to prove, you had to box. Everybody boxed in the Philly area. You had to box and you had to play football. And so I did it. And, I was done with it, kind of, so to speak, because I wanted to do the music. I told the coach, look, I don't want to play no more football. Because, you got to train. You got to put a lot of time into playing football, man. You got to go to camps and all that stuff, So.
Yeah. Well, you end up going to the Philadelphia Conservatory.
Yes, I did, yeah.
And what did you learn in that formal environment?
Well, I had always been attracted. As a matter of fact, it's a funny thing. My wife and I, we went to a concert down here yesterday. It was a concert of Mozart's Requiem. They had the concert at this brand new state-of-the-art theater they just put in at the university. It was a fabulous theater. And she said, well, let's go to this. So I went there to Mozart, to hear Mozart Requiem. And the point of fact is that I know the Mozart Requiem because I studied composition. I was always interested in large orchestral works from the very beginning. Now, I went to a high school. The high school I went to, Chester High School, was a very advanced high school for that time. We had, just to give you an idea, there was a fellow musician. He has now since moved to Toronto. He's with the Toronto Symphony. And we went to school together, and he caught up with me and called me and told me, well, I wasn't from Chester. Chester's right outside of Philly. He was from a place called Derby, which is about 40 miles east. And he said, I wasn't from there, but I went there because of the courses, The courses that we had at that high school were amazing for that time period. They were like a freshman course in a college or university. They really were. I was introduced to fundamental orchestration and arranging. We had theory classes, 1, 2 theory, music appreciation, ear training. It was amazing high school. When I went into college, when I first year after I got out of high school, I jumped into Philadelphia Conservatory, and I went there, and I took a composition course, and I was always interested in composed music and organ. I had an older brother who died in '87. He was a quote classical composer that he wrote in that vein. His name was Stephen Chambers, and he acquired quite a bit of work. He did some work, and I had, from listening to him and then listening from high school, listening to the works, I had always been interested in orchestral works. And when I went to conservatory, and after I left there, I went to D.C., and I moved to D.C., I went to American University studying compositions. That was my thing. Playing jazz at night and going studying composition in the daytime at the schools. So
let me ask you about being a part of Freddie Hubbard's LP Breaking Point. What was that experience for you like?
When I moved to D.C., after I put a year in at Philadelphia Conservatory, and I had to make money, and so I got a job. I don't know if you remember Bobby Charles, or rhythm R&B.
Yeah.
He had a song called "Tossing and Turning."
Yeah.
Okay. Now I get an idea of your age.
Yeah.
But I went on the road with that band. We went and we landed in D.C., and I really liked D.C. I liked what I saw at D.C. at that time. I decided to stay. So that's when I went and I hung out, and I got this job at the place called the Bohemian Caverns. It's a very, very landmark spot in D.C. We had a group called the JFK Quintet, and a dude named Andy White. Andy White's a very he's extremely. He was our kind of musical director. He also played classical oboe, and he transcribed. Had a phenomenal transcriber. We had this group called the JFK Quintet. We worked 6 nights a week, and I worked 6 nights a week for 3 years. Amazing. And the thing about it, that's the way all the clubs operated in those days. Even when I got to New York, my first job was at the Fire Spot, and we stayed for 3 months in '64. But anyway, at this place in D.C., the Caverns, everybody would come through town. What I mean by everybody, the circuit, you see, they had the theater circuit. The theaters like the Howard in Washington, D.C., the Uptown in Philadelphia, of course, the Apollo in New York, the Regal in Chicago. That circuit, which was alive and well for not only rhythm and blues, but for jazz. They had a lot of jazz shows in those theaters, and everybody came through town. Met Miles, Coltrane, Cannonball, Freddie with the Art Blakey. Everybody would come down to the Caverns. So I met all those people, and so it's like, oh, you come to New York, Yeah. All right. So when I was thought I was ready to leave, and I left, and my first job actually was with Eric Dolphy. Eric Dolphy had come to the Caverns. He worked with us for about 2 weeks, and I met Eric, and Eric was actually my first professional job was with Eric. And then Freddie was ready to leave. He left Art Blakey's band, and we did a. Some people are looking for this date. We did an engagement. It was Eric Dolphy, Freddie Hubbard, Bobby Hutcherson on vibes, and Richard Davis on bass, and myself. We did a show live in Brooklyn. and it was recorded. And for the love of me, I don't know where that recording is. But anyway, so Freddie was ready to start his band, and so he got me with Ron Matthews. It was Eddie Kahn, James Spaulding. Yeah, that was the group. So we jumped out, and actually we had 6 or 7, 8 weeks of work. We did 8 weeks, and then we went in and recorded that music, that breaking point.
So let me jump to New York. 63, you get there, and as you said, you hooked up with Eric Dolphy and was kind of in the avant-garde scene. What was it like to be in that scene as it was kind of coming into fruition, and to be around a force like Eric Dolphy?
Well, the thing about it was Eric, I don't consider Eric as a part of the so-called avant-garde. By that, I mean, not only but actually it was Freddie that pulled me in. I got pulled into the Blue Note scene, and I started doing these dates, and it was Eric, because Eric did a date for Blue Note. It's called Out to Lunch, and he had Freddie Hubbard on it. Who else was on it? Bobby. Now, Tony Williams was the drummer on it. Now, here's the thing. Eric knew that I was trying to write music. Matter of fact, I had written all this music while I was studying in D.C. I wrote a piece called Mirrors, and it was a classroom assignment. That's what it was. And it was supposed to be an example of mirror writing. And so I had that piece. He heard it. He told me, when I got to New York, he told me to come to the rehearsal for Out to Lunch, where I wasn't even playing drums on it. Tony Williams was the drummer on it. He told me to come. He told me to bring music and to bring mirrors. He was trying to get me in. That's what it was. I came there, and I pulled out the music and showed it, to everybody, and Freddie Hubbard saw it, and he liked it. And, he subsequently recorded it. And I remember so clearly, Tony Williams, who, of course, he's the great Tony Williams.
Yeah.
He was in awe. He was in awe of me. He was in awe of me pulling out that music. To me, it was nothing. But there was no drummers. There were no drummers around except maybe Max Roach, who was pulling out music at arrangements. None. There was nobody around. And that's another thing. Well, I'll get to that later. But I pulled out that music, and Tony Williams I remember the look. He was in awe of it. And point of fact is, Freddie took it, and he made a recording of it. Like, it was like that. And the Blue Note people, Alfred Lyons and Frank Wolf, they wanted me to, after I did that and made the date with Freddie Hubbard, I started getting all kind of calls to record. If you know my records, I recorded with Bobby Hutcherson. We did 9 albums for Blue Note. Joe Henderson, McCoy, Tyner, and Herbie was on a lot of those dates, Sam Rivers, Andrew Hill. So I was just like I was in the Blue Note family, so to speak. I was getting these calls to record every month, just about 2 recordings a month. It was like that. But they called me, they wanted me to record as a leader back then, but I didn't. I had no I had no business sense at all. I just shucked it off. Like, the guy asked me, Alfred Lyons, look, won't you come and show me some more of your music, blah, blah, blah. I didn't even do it. I was just spaced. I didn't know. I was too happy to be a sideman,
What did you learn about being around folks like, Mingus and Wayne Shorter and Hutcherson and McCoy, Tyner? What did you get from being around them?
Well, you get a lot of things. It's it's the one thing that you learn. I actually learn how to play by coming to New York. Now, when I teach today, and I teach the young people in the schools and colleges, and I don't encourage them to come to New York like that. A place like New York is not a place to be encouraged to come, especially today. Maybe always, but back then I didn't care. I was stupid. I was romance. It was like I didn't care what. I thought that if you struggle, that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But I tell the young students, a place like New York is not for everybody. It is not for everybody. First of all, it is today. Now, when I came to New York, you could get an apartment. You paid $150 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment.
Yeah. Right.
$140, $150 a month. You couldn't even get a kitchenette today in New York. A kitchenette, you know what that is. You know that the beginning prices for a kitchenette is like $1,500 a month, $2,000 a month.
Man.
Not even 1 bedroom. And it is, which is as far as today, and it could be relatively speaking. If you relatively speaking, you say, okay, back in 62, 63. You could get a rent. You paid rent $150 a month. All right, but you wasn't making. You made about $100. You made about $200 a week on a gig. So it's relative. The point I'm making is that the main issue in a city like New York, and it's not just New York. I would say most large metropolitan areas in this country is housing, affordable housing. You have to start off paying almost $2,000 a month for a kitchenette these days. It's just insane. The living costs are just incredibly insane to live in New York. And just that alone. So to get back to your point, when I worked in D.C., when we worked at that place 6 nights a week for 3 years, it takes a lot to do that. You have to be extremely rehearsed. We have to change the program from week to week and like that. But we really couldn't play. But I mean, we really didn't have. We weren't strong players individually. Now, see, when I got to New York, I learned how to bash, what we call bash, swing hard. I didn't really know how to swing back then. I was dabbling at it, but I learned how to swing by working with Hubbard and McCoy Tyner, especially McCoy Tyner. You see, I know you're familiar with the Coltrane, that quartet, and people think that Elvin Jones was the force behind it. Elvin was there. You know who was the force behind that? It was McCoy Tyner. The driving force was McCoy Tyner. I found that out. McCoy Tyner, now he's older these days, but McCoy Tyner is stronger than any drummer. He's strong. He will pull you. He'll pull you along. What I'm saying is that if you ever did you ever see that group live?
No.
Yeah, it was before your time.
Yeah,
you heard the records.
Oh, yeah.
You had to see that group live. You had to have seen that group live, and you would see the way they played, the way they swung, the way they drove and it would look like it was Elvin, though, but it wasn't Elvin. It was McCoy. McCoy Tyner was the driving force behind that group. He was the one that was pulling Elvin along. So I learned that. I learned that by working with McCoy Tyner. I learned how to play hard like that, and even Freddie also. So this is the things you learn. You learn when you come to New York, and you play with people like that, and Mingus, because that's. But it's also the other side of that is that in terms of all of it, for example, the recordings and dates that I did for Blue Note. There weren't many working bands. They weren't working bands. they sounded like working bands because of the way we went about the recording. So for Alfred Line and Blue Note, you rehearse for a whole week, 3, 4, 5 days, and then you go and record. And that's making you sound like a working band. See, those bands weren't working bands. And so consequently, it was an individual. There's too much individuality in jazz. That's the problem that I see. What I'm saying is that you don't have enough cooperative group cooperations or group consciousness, so to speak. You got a lot of individuals. Too much individuality in my instance. And that's the other side of it.
So let me ask you this. You know, Max Roach was a mentor for you. Tell me about being in the incarnations of Roach's M Boom percussion ensemble. What was that like?
Yeah. 1970, Max called myself, who else? Warren Smith, Roy Brooks. He initially called Jack DeJohnette. Oh, Jack was a little too busy. He was busy with Miles. So he called us all together, and actually it grew out of something he used to call Rise and Fly. Now, they used to have, back in the original Birdland, and they might have had this back in the old Kansas City too. What I'm saying is I don't think it's a new situation, but it's like the Battle of the Drums.
Yeah.
So now what they would do in Birdland, when I got there, it was still going on. They don't do it now. I try to put this to some club owners, but they would get 4 or 5 of the top drummers on the scene, and they have a group. They would have a group behind them, a small group, 4 or 5 players, and each drummer would take a turn with the group, and then in the end they would all be on the stage, and they would all like kind of battle. Well, not they could battle, they would put battle, but they would all have their turn to shine, and then they would end up playing it together. It was a tremendous show. It would be, the place would be packed to the rafters for what they used to call the Gretsch Drum Night. And then they would go on the road with this. They would tour with this. And I had heard of, and Max would take this to Europe, to Japan. 4 or 5 drummers on the one, or like they might have, like, I remember when the night I saw him, it was Max, Art Blakey, Elvin Jones, Mel Lewis, maybe Philly Joe Jones. And he would take this type of thing, they would go on the road and do tours in Europe with that thing. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to have that kind of format, because I remember I asked him, I said, well, look, what are we going to do? He said, no, we're going to do percussion. We're going to work the percussion, the orchestral percussion that we know in our culture, which consists of hundreds of instruments. But we're talking about timpani, the drum set, of course, timpani, all the mallet instruments, xylophone, marimba, vibraphone, glockenspiel, orchestra bells, close tallies, chimes, tunable chimes, African drums, conga drum, hand drums. And see, it leads you into world music, because you can deal with you start dealing with different ethnic drums. So that's what he wanted to do. So we had to learn how to do that. We took a whole year out in 1970 with no work. We just practiced. You had to learn the instruments. Yeah. That was when I began to get into the mallets. Now, I already was a piano player of sorts. I knew the piano. So to go into the vibes wasn't that hard for me. You just got to learn the sticking. Yeah. So we all had to take out, and we had to learn how to play the vibraphone. We had to learn how to play the marimba. We had to learn how to play timpani properly. So that's what we did for a whole year. We just rehearsed. We got together every Saturday and learned. It was learning the instruments. We did that, and we got our first work. A situation came up. It must have been 72 around there. We went to Dartmouth University, and so we put out some CDs and made some tours. And it was all through Max Roach, of course.
So let me ask you this. I want to get kind of into a little bit of your teaching component of your life. What is your philosophy as a teacher?
Most of the teaching that I've come across has been in relationship to jazz. I am a so-called jazz professor. But the thing of it is that you have to realize that people should realize or be made known that jazz, to know jazz, you have to know all of the elements of music, all of the fundamental elements that we deal with in our system. In other words, to be a good jazz player, you really have to know a lot about harmony and theory, the harmonic structure and the system of music that we deal with here. And so consequently, you have to have a very thorough knowledge of what they call classical music. You have to have a sound classical background to be able to play jazz. There's no doubt about it. So in teaching jazz per se, and I tell students this also, I tell them this everywhere. Listen, if you cannot learn to play jazz in a school. The intrinsic ingredient of jazz, we'll give a definition, a very generic definition. Jazz is music that it consists of elements of basically African, European, some degree Native American, whose intrinsic ingredient is that of improvisation. That is very generic. That's a definition of jazz. So, but you go to a music school, any music school, you will learn, you should be able to improve your fundamentals in reading and hearing, your ear, harmony, theory, to some degree composing and arranging. But you will not learn how to play jazz in a school. You cannot teach swing. You cannot verbalize swing. I say that, and I say it straight out. That's what you will not learn how to swing in a school. To learn how to swing, first of all, I'm also saying you do something that's not verbalized. It is a thing that has to be learned through an apprenticeship. You have to apprentice yourself underneath some masters, and you learn by doing, day in and day out, night in and night out. That is the way you learn the intrinsic ingredient of jazz. And I stand by that, and as one who is a so-called jazz educator.
Let me ask you this. Why do you love jazz? You've dedicated your life to it, but tell me why you love jazz. I don't know if
I do love jazz. I don't know. I know. I think it's me. I think it is me. It's in me. It is there. The essence of it. And I think, and I'm like Max and a lot of the masters. On back to Duke Ellington. They don't like these terms, man. And like bebop and they hated those terms, man. Max and Miles, they don't like these nicknames. Max used to call them nicknames. It's not enough. When you say jazz, of course you know jazz is it's a term that's in our society. It's in the grammar, but it connotates a lot of things. It connotates a lot of nebulous, negative things. The term itself is a derivative of jazz, J-A-S-S, which there has been, as far as I know, as far as I've researched, there's been no, except from we can't determine where it's coming from. Creole, some say, well, it's African. There's no, you can't relate it back to that. That relates to some kind of Creole or broken language, Creole being a derivative of French, jazz, J-A-S-S, hence jazz. but it has a connotation. It has a sexual connotation. Well, that's not negative, but it has jazz. It has a sexual connotation.
Yeah.
Jazz me. They used to say, "Jazz me, baby." So it has that, and then there was always a thing, and always a kind of a theory, not theory, but a notion, and they would say this, especially in the black ethnic situation in preachers, that it was the devil's music. Now, what they probably meant was that not so much the theory itself, the music, but the environment in which it was nurtured, which was the initial nurturing point of something that is distinctly called jazz. And but see, when I teach jazz history for me goes all the way back to you had to go all the way back to Egypt. Now, in my way of thinking, and then there's the migrations and the slave trade and all that. I'm going to give you a whole lecture now, but when you teach jazz history, when I teach jazz history, I do that whole trip back to Egypt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But to teach it properly, as far as the shores of America, you got to go from work songs. You go to work songs. You go to spirituals. Spirituals are different than gospel. Spirituals, work songs, minstrelsy. All of this is a part of it.
Yeah.
Ragtime, the development of ragtime, and jazz as a connotation, as a distinct element of something, comes into play in the latter part of the 19th century, and it was developed in the whorehouses, the brothels of New Orleans, which was initially a place for piano players, but then came the bands. They brought in the bands, and so that to me was the where the connotation of jazz being the devil's music applied in those early days, being the devil's music because of the environment in which it was nurtured. I'm like Max and all those cats. I don't have a term. That is a term that is known. I have no term. People say, well, it's the American classical music. Well, in effect, that's true. For me, it's true. It's the most developed of the indigenous musics. And there's a lot of stuff that stems off of jazz, of course, spirituals, gospel, and even to some degree with minstrelsy comes off, the Broadway shows come off of a minstrel format, so to speak. Yeah. And then you have the Great American Songbook. The Great American Songbook is something that's distinctly American. That's a distinct, very distinct American innovation in all of music. Well, you know what the Great American Songbook is.
Oh yeah.
And so, and what I'm saying, and as to your initial question, insofar is there are things, there is lifestyle that is associated with jazz, stereotypes. That was associated, especially in the modern, so-called modern era, or the bebop era, and drugs, which drugs became a prominent part of the Black American community. In the, if you remember seeing The Godfather, you see The Godfather series.
Oh, yeah.
Remember they had that big meeting up there of the bosses.
Yep.
This, I think, was the first one, and Brando called all of the people together, and they were trying to decide whether they're going to do drugs. He didn't want to get into the narcotics business.
Yep.
And so one guy stood up and said, "Well, we don't want it around children. We don't want it around the schools. Let's put it in the dark. Put it in with the black people." Remember that?
Yep, I do.
Yeah. So that is to say, I mean, you see something there, that don't mean you have to take it. But
yeah.
the drugs, those kind of drugs were distributed in the black community in the end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s. And, of course, the association of Charlie Parker with who Charlie Parker, who became a drug addict in the hospital.
Yeah.
So I'm telling you, son, that's your history there.
Yeah.
But anyway, so these things, and I'm saying, as to answer your question, it's not so much. It is me. It's not so much whether I love or not like it, or it's just me. It's a part of me. It is me.
Absolutely.
So. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it totally does. And I have one last question. I know you're far from being done in your career, but when the world leans back on the easy chair and they peel back the layers of jazz history, how would you like to be remembered for the contributions you made?
I'd like to be remembered as a person who was extremely creative, and particularly as a drummer who composed. This is why I always try to compose. I'm still trying. I'm trying to build myself or present myself as one who is in totality of being a musician, and the one who is, and also this breaks a stereotype for drummers too, because drummers have a particular stereotype hanging over them. And this is why I like Max Roach. I like Max Roach because he was a model. He was a model for me to. He showed me how to be in the music business.
Yeah.
You see, Max was always doing stuff like orchestras, choirs, theater. He created. He was always ahead, always branching out. I liked a lot of drummers, but Max was the one that I was actually trying to be like, really. So I like to when they lay out my story, they have to lay it out as someone who's in totality, or is a complete musician, from performing drums, percussion, and also composing and arranging.
Right on. That's perfect. That's a perfect way to wrap everything up. Joe, thank you for giving me your story and giving me your time today, man. Thanks for all the music.
All right, thank you. So,
thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Joe for his incredible journey, his music, and all that wisdom. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino on the iTunes Store, or visit theneonjazz.blogspot.com for all things Neon Jazz. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Neon Jazz.